Welcome to another live stream. So, I hope everyone is doing well, and I hope everything is working as usual. So, Louis is already in the chat. Hello, Louis. Well, actually, I don't know if you're in the chat now, but you sent a message before. So, if you're watching this back, then hello. And yeah, if you're watching, say hello in the chat, see who's here. But yeah, welcome to another live stream. So today, what we're going to be doing is having a look at a video that was recently published a few days ago, I think, by, let me show you, this YouTuber here, Unsolicited Advice, hence the title of this stream. So this guy, I actually don't know too much about him. I've had I've seen like brief clips with him in, mostly on Alex O'Connor's channel, Cosmic Skeptic. But even then, I haven't really watched any of the full videos. But I think what he does is he sort of does like video essays on philosophy and that kind of stuff. But yeah, unless I've just been like massively ignorant for a while, he seems to have like gained more of a following recently, or at least I've started to see a lot of his stuff pop up recently. And it wasn't until we posted a video, well, the video that we're going to be reacting to, this one, that I thought, okay, I'm going to sit down and watch one of his videos. So, full disclosure, I've not watched this video. So this reaction that I'm going to be doing with you guys, I've not seen this video before. This is a fresh off the press reaction. I'm assuming it's going to be quite like philosophical, and given this is my first time watching it, I'm either not going to have as much to say as I usually do because I'll be processing, or if I do say something, it might be fucking idiotic. So we will see. Cool. Life Strike is in the chat. Mario, Void Occupant, Zenape, Stardust, Danielle or Daniela. I think it's pronounced Danielle if it's spelled that way, right? And Anna. And Anna asks, how was my trip in Portugal? It was good. It was not last weekend, but the weekend before. I was only there for 2 days. So I was there for a friend's birthday, and then I spent sort of like 1.5 day on my own doing like going around Lisbon. But yeah, Portugal was very nice. I hope to go back there at some point and explore it a bit more. And yeah, unfortunately, obviously, Hannah, you're in Portugal. I know another antinatalist in Portugal who unfortunately weren't able to link up because just time constraints and stuff. But yes, it was very good. Thank you for asking. And flesh-eating gigantic rat is in the chat as well. And John H. What a name. And I'm the soul of the 1980s. Cool. Okay. So welcome everyone to the chat. Right. Yeah. Well, I don't think there's really anything else to go over, so we can start watching the video. So very quickly before we get dug in, let's have a look at the description. Like I've done a couple of times now, I have downloaded the video and boosted the audio a bit because yeah, I don't know what it is with the streams, but a lot of people keep saying on different ones, not everyone, but like for some of the streams, people say volume's too low. So, cool. So what's he going to be going over? So, he says, few things are more natural than reproduction. It is pretty understandable, and without this urge, we would have been wiped out a long time ago. I'm sure this wasn't intentional, but or maybe it is to, sort of algorithm and stuff, but like wiped out paints a picture of like an asteroid or, some big swathe of deaths and stuff like that. Whereas obviously antinatalism would be just the lack of reproduction. So wiped out is a bit misleading, but some philosophers have challenged us to justify this, and the antinatalists have an even stronger proposition that having children is morally wrong. So he's going to cover, I'm assuming this is an intro, potential harm and potential pleasure. So I'm guessing that's comparing a being who could exist, and he's sort of comparing the circumstances like sort of before. I say before they exist, that assumes they're going to come into existence, but it's sort of a being that hasn't been created and then a being who has been created. The harm of being, that's going to be like quality of life, reproduction, conception, and extinction. And then intuition and rationality. That one will be interesting. I'm sure all of it will be interesting, but that last section particularly. Right, I'll start screwing up, stop screwing around. And we can actually start watching the video. Let me just get it up. Cool. Okay. This stream is not sponsored by Squarespace, but his original video was. Cool. Okay. Hopefully the audio is fine. Let me know in the chat if anything comes up, but let's go.
It would be better if there were nothing, since there is more pain than pleasure on earth. In the book of Ecclesiastes...
So I'm just adjusting the volume a tiny bit because that is mashing me up. It's pretty loud. Yeah, that start. Let's just quickly revisit it because this is about antinatalism, and he's kind of starting with something which I don't think he's directly saying this is antinatalism, but he's starting with something that that kind of doesn't seem to me to be antinatalism.
About them in just a moment. It would be better if there were nothing, since there is more pain than pleasure on earth.
So so Arthur Schopenhauer. So I'm not saying he's made this mistake. I'm just going to pass two things apart for anyone that's watching that is sort of like new to antinatalism or anything like that. So basically the pronouncements he's not making the pronouncement. Arthur Schopenhauer has made that he's quoting. So that's more of like it sounds like antinatalism to like the untrained ear, but that isn't antinatalism. That's more pessimism. So there's kind of two things here. The first thing is the idea that it would have been it would be better if there was just nothing in the universe. I think by that what Arthur Schopenhauer means is like no life in the universe. I don't think he'd particularly care if there was a chunk of ice floating around or something. So yeah, the idea there. So obviously that is clearly a pessimistic statement, but is it antinatalist? So it's not so people might think it's antinatalist because people think like, oh, well, antinatalists, they don't want anyone to come into existence, so they don't want anything in existence, blah, blah, blah. Not necessarily. Antinatalism is specifically focused on bringing individuals into existence. So personally, I do think, like Schopenhauer, it would be better if the universe just had no sentient life in it. But there is sentient life here. Antinatalism is just saying that it's unethical to bring more sentient beings here, right? That doesn't necessarily entail the statement that it would be better if there was no life in the universe, because there's a difference between saying we shouldn't be it's unethical to create new sentient beings, and there should be no life in the universe, which is more an extinctionist position. So I've done a video on this. If you just type in, I'll try and remember at the end and put the link in the description of the live. But I've made a video that's called something along the lines of like the relationship between antinatalism and extinction. And basically, antinatalism simply says, let's not create any new lives. Whereas extinctionism says, don't create any new lives. And the ones that exist now have to end at some point. Now, obviously, given the state of the world as it is, all lives that exist now will come to an end. But say for the sake of argument that humans developed some sort of capacity for life extension, indefinite life extension. So, in my view, an antinatalist wouldn't really have anything to say about that, because that is an existing being, in this hypothetical, making a voluntary decision to indefinitely extend their life. Antinatalism has nothing to say about that. they may still have a poor quality of life, etc., all these things. But antinatalism is specifically about creating new lives. So what he's saying there, what Arthur Schopenhauer is saying there, that's more of a sort of pessimistic and sort of, if you were going to be sort of like calling people to action there, it would be more of an extinctionist call to action rather than an antinatalist one, if that makes sense. But anyway, hopefully I've made that distinction sort of like clear. Like I said, I've made a video on that. I'll put a link in the description. But let's continue.
In the Book of Ecclesiastes, the figure of King Solomon toys with a pretty strange proposition. Is it better to never have been born? Given the sufferings of life, is it all worth it? Or should we instead all regret the fact that we have come into existence? According to tradition, these...
And again, another interesting thing is, so this idea of like regret, regretting being born, again, is not the same with antinatalism, because antinatalism is the view that it's unethical to bring beings into existence, which again is separate from the idea that one regrets being born. Someone could regret being born themselves, but not have a general sort of view that it's unethical to bring life into existence, right? And what you find is that there are cases throughout history of individuals who do make this pronouncement that, or do make this moral condemnation of procreation and the creation of life, which I would say is an antinatalism, or some refer to it as like proto-antinatalism. But another thing that's kind of in the ballpark of proto-antinatalism that's not fully formed is this pronouncement that it would be better not to be born, which is, I'm not going to say it's not common in history, but compared to what you would think it would be, like given how rare this viewpoint is, it's actually like fairly common, relatively common, in history. Well, actually, I don't want to go that far because obviously I'm like overexposed to it because I'm not actively looking for these things. But like, it's not hard to find pronouncements like this in the past. I wouldn't call that antinatalism. And I forget exactly how he phrased his wording, so maybe he didn't say that was antinatalism either. But that pronouncement, I would say, is more like a sort of proto-antinatalist, pessimistic one of you regret being born. It's going one step further to make antinatalist pronouncements, which would be sort of like, I regret being born because coming into existence is some sort of thing to be lamented, and doing that to someone is wrong, so it's morally wrong to bring someone into existence. That would be the sort of like through line from that statement to antinatalism. But if someone makes that pronouncement, you can't necessarily conclude that they're an antinatalist or that it's an antinatalist statement, even though it does sound very antinatalistic.
These thoughts were written 3,000 years ago, and yet they have found some pretty staunch defenders in the modern day. These are the antinatalists, and they have two things to say. One, it would have been better if you had never been born. And two, you are morally obligated not to have children and subject another person to the trials and tribulations of life.
So again, this is interesting, and I feel like actually I am having more to say than I thought I would. So, and we're not even a minute in. So again, he was saying that like antinatalists have two things to say. So from my point of view, I agree with him. I 100% agree with him. I think it would have been better for each of us if we hadn't come into existence, and it's morally wrong to create new sentient beings. It depends how you define antinatalism, though. So if anyone saw, it's probably about a month ago now, there was a panel I was on with a few other antinatalists discussing what the definition of antinatalism should be. And the definition I put forward, and David Benatar, who was also on the panel, put forward, we put forward like very similar. I mean, there was like tiny word differences, but the thrust of our definitions were very, very similar. And we actually, and there was some discussion around this as well, and I can't remember the full details of it, so people have to go back and listen to that again. I'll try and remember to put a link in the description. But what we were saying was the motivations for someone having the view that it's wrong to bring beings into existence should kind of be left out of the definition of antinatalism, because there are a variety of motivations someone will have to come into that conclusion, and depends which ones you point at, but I can point at a couple that are like very valid. So someone maybe like Les Unite, for example, he has more of a sort of like biocentric environmental argument for antinatalism. I would consider him an antinatalist. You've got someone like me, a philanthropic antinatalist, and there will be a variety of others, right? Now, we can't include all of those motivations in the definition for antinatalism. It would be a clusterfuck. But the main thing we all share is this opposition to procreation / bringing new sentient beings into existence. So, interestingly, I would actually say, so he's obviously focusing on antinatalist philosophy. I think the main person he's going to be talking about is David Benatar. So it's understandable why he says that antinatalists have two things to say, which is it would be better you never been born, and then it's morally wrong to bring beings into existence. Benatar says sentient beings. I don't know if he's going to get into this in this video. But actually, if you're using antinatalist in the general sense, it's probably actually just the last one, because there may be antinatalists like Les, for example. I don't actually know Les's specific opinions on this, but Les, I would consider an antinatalist because he says that, you know, no one should be reproducing and it's morally wrong. But he says the reason is because of the impact of that human on, I'm sure Les has a variety of reasons, but the primary one he puts forward is for the reasons of the impact on other animals and the environment, right? So that's not necessarily a philanthropic concern. So Les, for the sake of argument, could, I don't know what his actual views on this are, but he could not have the position that it's better never to have been born, but he still has the position that it's morally wrong to bring at least humans into existence. So that was why I just wanted to sort of quibble with that a bit, because not all antinatalists will say that. They will all say the second thing he said, but the first thing, not necessarily. I would say the first thing, but not all of them would. Anyway, that's me finished rambling. Welcome Nadia to the chat. Merit Wave, Just a Pair, Aneds, Pablo, Life Strike I've already said hello to, and Matty as well. Cool. Okay, let's continue.
Today, we are going to examine their arguments, so you can find just how much you agree with this counterintuitive idea. Our main source will be David Benatar's excellent book, Better Never to Have Been, as it is by far the most comprehensive antinatalist philosophy I could find. But in addition, we will occasionally draw from later scholars and earlier thinkers. Get ready to learn why you should be more angry at your parents, how you vastly overestimate how good your life is, and whether we should wipe out the human race.
Again, I mean, it's probably just like YouTubeness that he's saying wiped out, but like I said before, it's not. Wiped out kind of conjures up this whole like going around and fucking like exterminating everyone with, you know, long swords and shit. But obviously that's not what antinatalism is about.
So, let's begin by looking at the very linchpin of the antinatalist worldview, that coming into existence unacceptably harms us. But before any of that, I want to thank today's very kind sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build...
Right, cool. I don't know how... fuck it, let's just like... I'll just manually skip through it.
And creating something untied their template who have never been born. Links in the description if you don't want to type all it out. But anyway, back to asking, was it better to have never been born? 1. Potential harm and potential pleasure. Imagine for a moment that you are considering whether to have a child, when there is a flash of light and you see the messenger of the Roman gods, Mercury, standing before you. He lets you know that the child you would conceive that night would become uniquely hated by the queen of the gods, Juno, who will subject them to endless disasters, meaning that they will suffer for the entirety of their existence. So great is her wrath that your child would not know a moment's peace from cradle to grave. Here, intuitively, we would say it would not be in the interests of that child to be born. Non-existence would be better than existence for them. Thus, it would benefit the child to never be born, since they would never have to suffer at the hands of Juno. For them, it is better never to have been. On the other hand, let's switch the scenario. Instead of Mercury saying that your child will be uniquely cursed, he instead says they would be uniquely blessed. If the child is conceived that night, they will be granted happiness beyond imagining. They would live a blessed life and experience endless pleasures. However, you nonetheless decide that you do not want a child, and so decide not to conceive them, at least at that moment. Intuitively, this situation seems importantly different, in that it does not seem bad for this child to never be born, in the same way that it was good for the previous child to have never been born. It seems that while this potential person certainly did not benefit from never existing, they were not harmed by it either. We do not judge them missing out on their charmed life as bad for them in the same way that we considered it good for the other child to have avoided all of their suffering. This asymmetry underpins one of David Benatar's primary arguments for antinatalism.
So another thing just to add on top of this, which I think Benatar does mention in the book, albeit briefly, I think, but you can look into it in more detail in like your own time, is this idea of anti-frustrationism, which is sort of, it's very much in the ballpark of the point that Benatar is making. So the idea, and I'm sure there's someone watching this who knows more about anti-frustrationism than me, but essentially the idea of anti-frustrationism is that a fulfilled desire is no better than a desire that was never created in the first place, and that avoiding the frustration of desires is the primary thing that we should be tending to, rather than trying to, like I said, create desires that will be satisfied. So this kind of is very much like the asymmetry David Benatar was putting forward, because like Benatar says, or like I actually don't know his this guy's name. I don't know if his name is public, but unsolicited advice. He's sort of relaying Benatar's axiological asymmetry. So in the case of, let's start the other way around. In case of, he talks about God blessing this child and them having an amazing life, right? So an anti-frustrationist would say that the reason that it is no better than simply never existing to create that child is because that child, although they'll have an amazing life, that amazing life will simply cater to and satisfy desires that were created in creating the child. And anti-frustrationism says a satisfied desire is no better than a desire that was never created, because the only reason it needs to be satisfied is because it exists in the first place. So there's a guy whose name is escaping me now, but Benatar uses his example in the book. And he basically, he takes a very counterintuitive and weird desire that someone could have, and it could be instilled in them, to demonstrate why the simple addition of a satisfied desire is not necessarily a good thing. But we often perceive the satisfaction of our own desires in the context of us being born as a good thing, or the presence of satisfied desire in the context of us being born as a good thing, probably because of the fact that we're just so used to it, and it's almost something we've been indoctrinated to think. It's just constantly repeated to us. So the example that's used is, if I'm going to get this right, you can tap this person next to you, and through tapping them instill this, a desire will appear in them for the nearest tree to the Sydney Opera House to be painted red. And the nearest tree to the Sydney Opera House is painted red, or will be painted red. And so this desire that this person has is now satiated, right? No reference to any pleasure or anything like this, because of course pleasure would then be an external desire, another desire that's being attended to. We're simply looking at that desire that has been created in that individual. The satisfaction of that desire, the nearest tree to the Sydney Opera House being painted red, seems trivial and completely unnecessary, and it would have been we're completely indifferent to this desire being created in the first place. It seems like creating that desire and then it being fulfilled through the closest tree to the Sydney Opera House being painted red has added nothing good to this person's life nor the world in general. And yeah, so this is trying to make the point that simply creating a desire and it being fulfilled is not necessary. It's not a good thing. It's not better than simply not creating the desire in the first place. Like the case with the good life that this guy is talking about. On the other hand, though, a frustrated desire is a bad thing. So if we create a desire out of nothing, which is what we do when we create someone, because through creating someone, you bring with that person inherently desires in them. If those desires are frustrated, which in the world they will be, this is a negative thing. The frustration of desires, and there's sort of an asymmetry there, and it sort of reflects the asymmetry that Benatar is talking about, why he sort of mentions it in his book. And I thought that's just another thing to add. It's sort of slightly different from Benatar's asymmetry, but it's kind of reflective of it, but with a different flavor. Cool. Yeah, and to put it in one way that I put it when I'm talking to people, which is just very short and sharp, is like you're creating fucking hell, how do I usually put it? I've forgotten the thing I usually say. So you're creating someone to experience good things they never existed to want in the first place, at the cost of them experiencing bad things which will be terrible for them if you create them. And that just seemed... Did anyone see that glitter? That was very strange. So I'm just watching it back to see if there was something, if I'm seeing things. Yeah, did people see those fireworks? What was that? No idea what that was. That was so weird. I've lost where I was. But yeah, I think I'd basically covered everything I was going to say. Cool.
In essence, Benatar argues that whereas it is good to have avoided harm by never existing, it is neither good nor bad to be deprived of pleasure by never existing. It is actively good to prevent the potential harms of life, but it is neither good nor bad to deprive a potential person of pleasure. And thus, he says it is better not to have children than to have them. In other words, Benatar thinks that pain is bad and pleasure is good. But whereas an absence of pain is good regardless of whether the potentially pained person exists, the absence of pleasure is neither good nor bad for never existent people. So, whereas the first child in our little thought experiment benefited by never having existed, the second child was not harmed by never having existed. This is sort of a tricky point to get your head round, so do feel free to pause the video and mull it over for a second. Benatar gives a number of examples to illustrate this asymmetry, noticeably around the themes of regret and decision-making. For instance, a very good friend of mine has a pretty unpleasant genetic condition, and he has expressed multiple times that he would not want to have children as he would not want to pass this on to them. Now, regardless of whether or not you think he is justified in his assessment, we can nonetheless understand his reasoning. He wants to prevent the future harm of his child and has decided not to have one as a result. He has even said that if he did end up having a child, he is pretty sure he would regret it. And not because he does not want to look after a child, in fact, he has very strong paternal instincts. But rather, he says he would regret having that child for the child's sake. On the other hand, imagine that someone was the most handsome man in the world, say Henry Cavill, yet he also decided not to have children. Plausibly, if he later came to regret that decision, it is unlikely to be because he regrets depriving a potential child of his astonishing good looks. He might be sad that his genetic blessings will end with him, but if you believe Benatar, it does not make sense to say he regrets it on behalf of the potential child. Indeed, if you thought that it was bad here for the child not to be created, then you might end up arguing that Henry Cavill has a positive duty to have children. And not only that, but as many children as...
Well, I may be an antinatalist, but when it comes to Henry Cavill, obviously all of our principles have limits.
...as possible. And most people are unwilling to accept a conclusion like this. But then, if we take on board this asymmetry, Benatar points out this has significant conclusions for our own ordinary decisions to reproduce as well. For each of us, our lives will contain some mixture of pleasure and pain. It is not really plausible that there are people for whom life contains absolutely no unpleasantness, even if we would consider that their lives are very, very fortunate. Even someone like Jeff Bezos, who does not share the same troubles most of us have, will still endure some suffering in his life.
Yeah, I mean, even someone like Jeff Bezos, like, it's not even some suffering. Like, I would, obviously, when, you know, if I'm going to use the word significant, people are going to ask what significant means. And I guess it's very hard to put a pin in it. But I think, like, if you were able to, and obviously this would be extremely difficult to do, but if you were able to sort of be able to sort of observe the whole of even Jeff Bezos's life, and you know, Jeff Bezos is one of the, if not the most privileged people to have ever existed in you know, in the way of, like, he has access to so many resources. I mean, he could basically have whatever he wants. And I'm sure if we were able to, like, really dig in and analyze his life, there would be, like, it would be characterized by a significant amount of desire, frustration, also just general negative experience. There were probably some things that he would like to have done but couldn't. Because obviously, even though he has a lot of money and resources, it can't get you everything. For example, there may have, you know, it can't bring, like, a family member back. You know, if maybe he would have had a desire to do a specific thing with his father, but if his father's now dead, no amount of money in the world is going to be able to get that, to be able to get him that experience with his father. And it's even, like, the nature of the human predicament is such that if you are someone like Jeff Bezos and you can literally basically have, apart from those things that are impossible to get, like I just said about his experience with his father, like, whatever money can get you, he's going to be able to get, and probably a bit more than that. And just the fact that he can get anything he wants, even that's going to come with a slight negative, because there are some things that we enjoy the pursuit of trying to get, whereas he's not necessarily going to have that, you know, because he can just basically just click his fingers and get anything he wants. And yeah, that is also going to be sort of have a negative tinge to it. I guess it's a bit like the sort of yin yang, right? Like, every good comes with, like, a tinge of bad. But yeah, I think people get the point I'm making there.
This was famously pointed out by the Buddha over 2,000 years ago when he remarked that suffering was inevitable, regardless of who we were. When we reproduce, we are simultaneously bringing about two distinct things: the future suffering of our child and their future pleasure. However, if we accept the asymmetry, then preventing the former is a good thing, whereas preventing the latter is neither good nor bad. It is good for the potential child that they would never suffer if they never existed, but it is neither here nor there that the potential child would miss out on all of that pleasure. Again, Benatar's point is that an absence of pain is good even if there is no one around to not feel it, whereas an absence of pleasure is merely not bad if there was no one around to not feel it. As I said, this is a very tricky point to get your head around, and you can outright reject the asymmetry, but Benatar's examples make it scarily plausible.
Yeah, and I think just to go over it, like, so the way I understand the asymmetry is it is essentially just a presentation of certain values someone can have pertaining to the goods and bads of life from the perspective of an individual who may come into existence, right? But there's a variety of other ways you can value those things. It doesn't have to be the axiological asymmetry that Benatar puts forward. And that is true. And as far as that goes, it like your assessment can just come down to what your values are, how you sort of like intuitively value those things. I think one thing you can do though is you can present different consequences that come as a result of holding those values. And then someone may sort of like tentatively hold certain values, say a symmetrical set of values rather than asymmetrical. And then someone might present a consequence of those. So, for example, if you hold the asymmetrical, like the asymmetry of values, then it's not sufficient, but it sort of gets you a lot of the way there to antinatalism, right? Especially in the world as it exists today. So someone could come to you and say, okay, you have these values. That's sort of a consequence of that is that you should adopt this position, which would be antinatalism. Now, likewise, if someone has a symmetrical set of values on this question, there could be another position that leads from that. And so an antinatalist could say, okay, well, if you want to have those values, this is a sort of a view you're going to have to adopt, or as people say, a bullet you're going to have to bite, stuff like that. Now, that's a way to make it more than just a matter of these are my values and let's end the conversation there. Because someone could put the asymmetry forward, but then someone could just say, well, I don't buy it, I take a symmetrical view. But then and someone may say, okay, well, that's the conversation over. That's it, done. It's just a difference of values. And it may be just a difference of values, but what you can also do is test where those values lead. And if that person is willing to maintain an adherence to those values, given the consequences. And in my view, given the consequence of the other values, like I personally, I see the asymmetry as leading to less reductio ad absurdums than other sets of values. But also, one man's reductio ad absurdum is another man's, that is a reasonable thing to accept. So when it gets down to like base values, it can often be actually like very hard to say who is right and wrong, and especially if you don't think morality is objective. And yeah, it's a difficult one, but yeah, it's not just a matter of values. It's also like looking at what the sort of consequences are of those, and will you accept them?
I also want to note here that the asymmetry can be challenged on philosophical grounds, as it has been by David Boonin, but we don't have enough time to get into that. Additionally, if you're an Epicurean, then you might think that the question of non-existence or existence is inherently morally neutral, since there is no way to say that it is a good or bad state for someone to not exist, since they don't exist and they can't bear properties. Again, I don't have time to go into these objections in detail, or else this video would be several hours long. But I do just want to highlight them so that we're aware that this is not a settled debate. In theory, the asymmetry principle is all that Benatar needs for a form of antinatalism. Since it is actively good to prevent the harm of potential people, but it is neither good nor bad to prevent their pleasure, it is more moral to refrain from having children than to have them. And in either case, it is harming the child to bring them into existence. Remarkably, if you fully accept the asymmetry, this would even be the case if the child in question would only suffer a small amount of unpleasantness, but an overwhelming amount of pleasure. Since even preventing a negligible amount of harm would be good, whereas preventing a huge amount of pleasure would still be neither good nor bad. However, Benatar realizes that, by itself, this is unlikely to convince people not to have children. So this is where his second argument comes into play. He argues that our lives are significantly worse than we tend to think, and are far more characterized.
So I'm actually, the video I'm mainly working on at the moment is on this, like the quality of life. And depressingly, I'm calling it, your life is worse than you think. It's a wild ride to write. But yeah, so it's been quite interesting actually. I mean, it's not finished. I haven't finished like a first draft or anything. I still need to do like more research and flesh it out so it flows well and stuff like that. But yeah, this is what I'm working on at the moment.
By suffering than by pleasure. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The harm of being. Benatar recognizes that there is a very serious objection to any form of antinatalism. People overwhelmingly do not regret coming into existence, and on the whole tend to view their lives in pretty positive terms.
So I've done a couple of videos relating to this. So one is a sort of general video on why most people saying that they're happy to exist or they're glad to be born isn't it doesn't provide moral permission to create new sentient beings. And I'll try and remember to put that in the description. Another one is one I actually released recently, which I sort of refer to this thing that I call natalist Stockholm syndrome, where basically the way I view people who are glad to be born is that they're suffering from a sort of form of Stockholm syndrome. And I explain it in much more detail in the video. So I'll try and remember to link it in the description. But to sort of put the relevance of that here is that the people who say they're glad to be born, if we are to accept that simply someone saying that they're glad something happened, it provides us moral permission to do the thing to them that they say they're glad to happen, then it leads to like very worrying things we have to accept. So for example, Heta Hyri in, I think it's called The Limits of Paternalism, gives this example of saying, well, if we're to accept someone saying they're glad to be born, and people generally saying that as permission to create new people, then this is like saying, as long as we can manipulate someone in such a way where they enjoy what is happening to them or sign off on it retrospectively, then it's okay to do. Which would mean that if a government wanted to just, in some sort of like factory farm type situation, breed loads of people and train them to be sort of like political or religious extremists, as long as they are able to indoctrinate them in such a way where they think it's good that this has happened, i.e., like a suicide bomber, for example, has been indoctrinated to such an extent where they think killing themselves, even killing children, blowing up children, mutilating them, is a good thing, and they're glad it's happening to them and to the children, then it's morally okay to bring about that situation. Personally, I don't think it is. I don't think it's morally okay to bring about the situation where someone is glad to have been born. I mean, I'm glad that they're in a situation where their life is positive. Presumably it is, if they're making that judgment. But I don't think that gives us moral permission to bring about those circumstances through creating new people. Just like I don't think it's okay to radicalize people into some sort of militant form of Islam, for example, where they go and, blow themselves up, just because people who are suicide bombers probably all are glad that they're currently in this position where they're going to blow themselves up, because as I see it, they are under a massive misapprehension and they've been manipulated, whether intentionally or not. I'm not saying anyone who says they're glad to be born has been intentionally manipulated. It's just they're suffering from what I see as a form of Stockholm syndrome. But yeah, anyway.
This even goes for people who are often perceived of having lives of reasonably poor quality, such as the extremely infirm or the terminally ill. When asked, would you rather have not been born, most people have no trouble in giving a definitive no, and out of those who would answer yes, an even smaller number actually follow through on a wish to unmake themselves. So Benatar's position...
Well, hang on. I mean, he says that very few of them follow through, but he's saying that as if someone says they are not glad to have been born, that then the logical thing for them to do is end their lives, which I don't think it is. Again, fucking hell, I've gotten to the point where I've done so many videos that I can say I've done a video on this like 10 times in a stream. So I've done a video on this about why, antinatalists don't end their lives. Now, clarification, obviously some antinatalists, like natalists, do end their lives. But I mean, antinatalists are not required to by their position. And that's because there's a difference between starting life and continuing one. I'm not going to get into it in super detail, but again, the video is there. Why antinatalists don't kill themselves. And again, I'll try and remember to link it in the description. But yeah, he's kind of making out something. He's making something out that actually isn't the case.
...has an immediate response. If we can be sure that the child we will create would positively evaluate their own life, how can we say that we should not have created them? Well, here Benatar discusses the second pillar of his antinatalist philosophy, that our lives are significantly less pleasant than we think, and that it is only irrational cognitive bias that blinds us to this. First of all, Benatar accuses humanity in general of Pollyannaism, or having a sunnier view on life that is strictly warranted. He cites numerous pieces of empirical psychological research which suggest we overestimate both the positive aspects of our past and overestimate the positive elements of our future when we are asked to reflect upon them. He also points out that we engage in hedonic adaptation, where if our lives, objectively speaking, take a turn for the worse, either from the perspective of our health or our monetary status or our relationships, we initially very much feel the difference and report lower levels of well-being. However, over time, this evens out, and we eventually become accustomed to this new circumstance. It is very similar to the observation made by Albert Camus that people can adapt themselves to a great many situations, even pretty awful ones, given enough time. This assessment was also made in the opposite direction by Epicurus, who points out that when our lives improve above a certain base level, that will lose its luster pretty quickly, and we then have to achieve even more to get that thrill back. This is essentially hedonic adaptation in reverse, sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. Secondly, Benatar says that our own assessments of our well-being are much more likely to correlate to how fortunate we perceive ourselves to be as compared with others around us, rather than any sort of absolute judgment on the quality of our lives. Combined with Pollyannaism, he suggests that these comparisons are more likely to show our lives and our character in a more favorable light than is strictly justified. I'll put a few of the studies that he cites in the description in case you want to check them out. Overall, Benatar thinks this bias makes an awful lot of sense. It is probably an evolutionary advantage to be on the optimistic side, and if he is right that we would not feel compelled to reproduce if we truly realized what life was like, then a realistic view of the world, as Benatar sees it, would be automatically bred out of the gene pool. All of this causes him to conclude that we cannot trust our intuitive self-assessment of our own lives. We cannot simply go...
It does kind of make sense. I mean, our genes are not optimizing for, they're optimizing for reproduction. They're not optimizing for an accurate understanding of reality or our own lives. Now, obviously, our understanding of reality and our own lives has to be accurate enough for us to be able to function. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to function at all and get to reproductive age and pass our genes on. So it is I don't know if I'd say optimizing, but it's selecting for that to a degree, but it's not necessarily optimizing for it. It's optimizing for reproduction. So our accurate understanding of reality, to the extent that it is accurate, presumably from an evolutionary point of view, it is only to serve our reproduction. It's sort of like, well, yeah. And so to me, it's no wonder that we sort of don't naturally have a super accurate understanding of either reality or our own lives. So yeah, and that's not necessarily a point in favor of the quality of life being bad. It could be the case that our quality, our lives are much better than we understand. I don't think that's the case. But what I'm saying is that it's understandable that there's going to be like probably like a somewhat significant amount of epistemological uncertainty, just because we haven't evolved optimizing for accuracy in our understanding of our own lives and of the world around us. We're optimizing for reproduction and passing on our genes. Yeah.
Oh, well, since most people think...
And then, yeah, a tiny bit to add on to that is like, and then it also kind of makes sense from an evolutionary point of view that we would overestimate the quality of our lives, because that will sort of contribute to driving us to reproduce. If we have this general sort of notion that our lives are positive and that it's worth living, then this will sort of contribute to us making the decision to procreate, along with just like, our sex drive and wanting to have sex and stuff like this, and conformity, etc., etc. If we were to underestimate how good our lives are, and to think that they are worse than they are, this would likely count against our considerations for reproducing, at least to some degree. So it seems like there would be a selection pressure against that. Some other people may be watching this and know more about this than me, but it seems reasonable to two things. From an evolutionary point of view, one, recognize that there is uncertainty and inaccuracy in our assessments, and two, we're probably, from an evolutionary point of view, more prone to overestimating how good our lives are than underestimating. I'm not an expert though, but that seems to make sense to me.
Think their lives are pretty good, then they must be pretty good. Because, for him, this judgment is largely driven by irrational or irrational factors. Funnily enough, Nietzsche was also pretty skeptical of how people assess their own lives, since he thought they were inherently a biased party. But he extended this to judgments about life in general, so would ultimately disagree with David Benatar's conclusions. Having argued for this disconnect between self-assessment and reality, Benatar compares a few different theories of assessing objectively how well one's life is going. And he suggests that, on all of them, most lives really do not come out with shining colours. He starts with hedonistic theories of life assessment, where a life is judged by how much pleasure or pain someone feels. Here, he argues that if we were to pay close attention, most of our lives are marked by some form of discomfort or displeasure. There are biological displeasures, such as hunger, thirst, sexual frustration, or tiredness. Or there are emotional displeasures, like sadness, anger, fear, or ennui. Benatar states that, empirically, we are normally in one or more of these states at any given time. You can test this now. Which of them do you think you're in? These states also come to us very naturally. All we have to do to become hungry is not get up to eat. Benatar then says that our positive states are often characterized by a lack of active negative state, such as the relief we feel when we finally have an empty to-do list. States of extreme excitement or positive pleasure are very rare for Benatar, and he argues that most of the things that we call pleasure are basically some form of relief. His point here is not that life is unbearably hard, but he says there is something odd about deciding to start a life where there are lots of active negative states, but most of the positive ones are simply characterized by a temporary pause in the negative feelings. If that were the deal presented to us when we started life, he suggests we would likely not take it.
Yeah, so there are a few other sort of aspects to why our lives are worse than we generally think, but I'm not going to go through them all now because I still need to fully flesh them all out and I'm still working on the video. But I would say in the next sort of like 2 months, I'll probably have a video out on this, trying to fully flesh it out from a variety of different angles.
Once we're here, we may as well make the best of it, especially if death strikes us as particularly painful or terrifying. But Benatar thinks we should not inflict this state on someone else. He presents a similar line of argument for the desire fulfillment models of human well-being. He points out that if we judge a life based on how many of the desires are fulfilled, then we really do not come out well. He argues that a huge number of our wants simply go unanswered, or take an inordinate amount of time and effort to achieve, or are achieved only temporarily. Moreover, as soon as we achieve a desire, our wills have no issue with coming up with another to take its place. You can really detect notes of Schopenhauer here. In fact, philosophies like Buddhism or Stoicism or Schopenhauer's pessimism deal with this by asking us to slowly rein in our desires until they are within a fulfillable bubble. So, on this view too, Benatar is pretty sure that life is, if not a total raw deal, a raw enough deal that we should probably not go about creating new lives willy-nilly. Together, Benatar's asymmetry argument and his argument that life is a lot less pleasant than we think lend credence to the idea that there might be moral issues with having children and with creating lives more generally. The asymmetry argument suggests that if life has any harm, and certainly if it has...
That's interesting that he included creating lives more generally. I wonder if there he's making a reference to, as Benatar does, like other instances where we create lives, like, you know, through our sort of like food choices, through paying for animals to be bred into existence in farms.
A significant amount of it, then we should avoid creating new lives. While the second argument aims to show that life has far more harm in it than we normally consider, and that we cannot trust our own judgment that life is, on the whole, positive. As Benatar puts it, coming into existence is always a harm, and it is a serious harm. Right, that is a brief overview of the broad strokes of Benatar's points. I do want to emphasize that he has far more extensive versions of these arguments in his book. But now I want to move on to examining the consequences of the antinatalist position, which Benatar freely admits are both extensive and remarkably counterintuitive. 3. Reproduction, conception, and extinction. So far, we have largely discussed the philosophical foundations for antinatalism. That is, the arguments that suggest that life is not worth starting. But the second half of Benatar's book is...
I'm glad that he specifically said life is not worth starting, because so many people get it confused and say life is not worth living. And even if they don't mean that, even if they mean that lives are not worth starting, they may say life is not worth living, just because that they're used to that it being said that way. But yeah, it really needs to be clear that it's specifically lives are not worth starting, because life's worth living. There's an ambiguity there between starting lives and continuing lives. But given that, I mean, maybe this guy was aware of antinatalism anyway, but he might have come across it through his interactions with Alex O'Connor, because Alex has interviewed David Benatar and had a discussion on antinatalism before, and in that discussion with Jack Hancock, who runs Humane Hancock, they make it clear that there is this distinction between starting a life and continuing one. So yeah, if he did learn about antinatalism through Alex, then it's no doubt he's also made this distinction, or it's not surprising.
Slightly wider in scope, and instead examines what is downstream from this proposition. And we shall start with the obvious points about having children. I want to clarify that since now we are discussing the consequences of antinatalism, we will have to assume that it is true for the purposes of this section. But that doesn't mean that you or I are committed to its simpliciter. One immediate consequence of Benatar's arguments is that having a child is bad for the child in question, and to that extent seems immoral. But there is a further issue. To what extent do we allow this immoral action in society? There are some ills, like murder or physical assault, which we make illegal, while there are some others, like adultery, which we do not, even if an affair probably does more harm than slapping someone in the face. So, while Benatar thinks that we should independently choose not to have children, the idea that there should be some top-down intervention to prevent us having children is left somewhat open. On the one hand, we might think that people have the unmitigated right to control their own reproduction, whatever the circumstances. The idea of compelling someone to refrain from having children leaves a pretty nasty taste in the mouth, especially after the eugenics movements of the 20th century. And, as we will explore in more detail later, nasty tastes in the mouth are the stuff ethical objections are built on. Benatar clarifies that he does not think people have the moral right to have children, since he cannot simultaneously say that we have a duty not to have children and a right to have them. However, he does say that reproduction may fall into the same sort of category as something like adultery, a harm that we nonetheless do not make illegal because of the dangers or consequences of enforcing a law against it. Think about what the consequences of an actively antinatalist policy might entail. Things like forced medical procedures or infidelity arguably may cause more harm than allowing further people to be brought into existence. Benatar also concedes we may say someone has the absolute right to control their own reproduction, regardless of the consequences. Of course, none of this affects Benatar's overall idea that at the individual level we have a duty not to have children. He just thinks it is not a duty that should definitely be enforced by the state. For instance, we also plausibly have a duty to not promote false statements, but the idea of the state making lying or just untruths illegal seems a pretty significant overstep. The only exception Benatar raises to this would be if the population could be made infertile painlessly, like through some chemical distributed in the air. But on the whole, he's pretty ambivalent about this proposal as well. And privately, I'm quite thankful that most people are. Benatar is also pretty clear that antinatalism does not imply a pro-death position. Just because a life is not worth starting does not mean it is not worth continuing. And I basically concur with this point. Plausibly, the whole reason antinatalism arises as a distinct moral question is because the relevant party, the unborn child, is not present. Once someone is alive, you can ask them if they want to continue living. Sure, they may overestimate the quality of their lives, as Benatar himself argued in the last section, but we can delegate the responsibility of life or death decisions to them. They are a full agent who can make their own choices. It may have been better for them to have never been born, but they're here now, so they can decide where to go. It's a bit like getting lost on a hike. It would have been better to have never set off, but now that you're there, you can make a series of choices, one of which is death. Benatar also says that once you exist, you might plausibly have an interest in continuing to exist, such as wanting to bring about certain states in the world, experience more pleasure, or have your desires fulfilled. But perhaps Benatar's most controversial conclusion from antinatalism is that he is pro-extinction. Since he thinks
Oh, I thought he was going to say pro-death on abortion.
that, all things considered, it would be better for each future person to have never been born, he ultimately concludes that it would also be better for the human race as a whole to stop existing. Now, it's important to clarify exactly what Benatar means by this. He is not suggesting that extinction should be achieved by killing everyone on Earth. And he also points out that if everyone stopped having children at this very moment, then the last 100 years or so of humanity would be very difficult indeed. We would probably all die horribly when there were no longer enough people who could work farms or keep reservoirs running. Instead, Benatar's ideal scenario is a sort of phased extinction.
So all of this sort of stuff, like the difference between killing off extinction, dying off extinction, the different scopes of extinction, like anthropocentric, sentiocentric, I go over all of these in my video on the relationship between antinatalism and extinction. I don't go over phased extinction, which is what he's going to get onto next, though.
Whereby we gradually tail off the number of people until the human race ceases to be with the least amount of suffering.
And actually, interestingly, so like Benatar is not dogmatic about this. And, you know, to be honest, in my experience, there are many antinatalists that aren't dogmatic about this. So in my experience, there are many antinatalists who sort of hold antinatalism to the same degree that they would hold a position of being against killing, right? Like, being against killing is something that we are generally against. We see it as immoral and we will call it murder. But there are some instances where killing is justified, even though it may be seen as a harm. So self-defense, or if someone requests for you to, kill them in like an assisted dying type situation, if that's legal in the country. All of these sorts of types of things, right? But generally, we take a position of being against killing, even though we can see that in some instances, our hands may be forced. This is the same sort of position that I think many antinatalists hold on antinatalism. Like, yes, into existence is a harm, procreation is unethical, creating new sentient beings is unethical. But there may be some instances where exceptions can be made. And one instance that Benatar talks about in Better Never to Have Been is phased extinction, about how, there may be certain instances where bringing new humans into existence to facilitate a phased extinction may be the sort of lesser of two evils. And so he says maybe it can be justified in those instances. And I think that's pretty reasonable. There are like very few moral issues where you can say, I'm against this, and there are absolutely no circumstances at all where I think it could be justified to engage in that action. And like I said, killing is one of them, right? Like we see killing another person or killing another sentient being as one of the worst things you can do. But even then, there are exceptions, right? For example, like self-defense. But anyway, let's continue.
Impossible.
Or I'll give another example. Like there are certain activities we engage in where we kind of accept a sort of level of that thing being done. So, for example, like driving, etc., etc. We know certain number of people and animals are going to be killed, and we sort of accept this, whether rightly or wrongly. I'm not necessarily saying all these things are like we're justified in accepting. I'm just saying we tend to accept them. But again, there's a distinction between accepting sort of incidental forms of harm like that and intentional forms of harm. So obviously, just because we accept a certain level of humans and animals are going to be killed through driving, doesn't mean we can go out and intentionally kill humans for our pleasure or animals for our pleasure, for example.
Benatar admits this seems sad. It's also a small price to pay for preventing the suffering of all the generations that would succeed us. And remember, since preventing suffering is good even in the absence of the person who would have suffered, this is a huge moral victory, as well as a huge personal victory for every potential person who will now no longer be born. I kind of appreciate Benatar sticking by his principles here. A lot of thinkers would have shied away from this, or deemed it a repugnant conclusion, but he follows through. And it is undeniable. If you're an antinatalist on the grounds that it is better to have never been born, then barring some very special consideration, it would be much better if the whole human race slowly dies off, since then no more people can be born.
Yeah, so exactly. So in practice, I agree with him. But if we're talking about the abstract and we're just talking about ideas, then not necessarily. Like, once people are here, if, for example, like I said, we were able to get to the point where people could live indefinitely, I got no issue with that. Like, as long as they're not using their indefinite life to bring loads more beings into existence, obviously. But yeah, in practice, given that, we live the lives we do and everyone dies and stuff, yeah, I agree with him.
Of course, different antinatalists will have different conclusions for each of these points. Someone who bases their position primarily on the idea that life is truly awful may take a pretty pro-death position. But if so, this would be technically separable from their antinatalism. These are all pretty tough pills to swallow.
I'm glad he also makes that clarification as well.
So the question inevitably arises, what about the unintuitiveness of antinatalism? Is that not a point against it? Well, Benatar himself does not think so, but the particular way in which he argues this point is fascinating, and I think we can use it to learn about topics far beyond the particular morality of having children. Which is why, for our final point, I would like to hone in on ethical intuition. 4. Intuition and rationality. There are very few things more intuitive than the idea that having children is not a bad thing. As Benatar himself points out, if we did not have this intuition, then we would have died out a long time ago, though perhaps he regrets this ultimately did not happen. Benatar then has to argue that this intuition is either in some way irrelevant or outweighed by other factors. He does most of this in the final chapter of his book, which is perhaps the most philosophically interesting one as well. Benatar criticizes the intuition that having children is not bad, as either irrational or irrational, just like our judgment that life was good. He says that our intuitions here seem thoroughly untrustworthy. And I'm actually going to read directly from the book here, because I think the way he puts this point is very interesting. How reliable can an intuition be? if it allows the infliction of great harm that could have been avoided without any cost to the person who is harmed. Such an intuition would not be worthy of respect in any other context. This essentially pits the pronatalist intuition against the points Benatar has made in his book. If his arguments are right, then the intuition that reproduction is good or neutral causes a lot of damage, and so should not be respected. But, of course, like pretty much any ethical argument, Benatar's own position begins with an intuition, the one that supports the asymmetry principle, or the axiological asymmetry principle.
Yeah, I think when you get down to it, like, no one can escape intuition. Like, all of our values are ultimately based on intuition, at least as far as I understand. So there's no escaping it to a degree. But like I said before, there are certain things you can do to escape just getting in a sort of gridlock of, well, these are my values and these are your values. You can test what the consequences of those are, and see if those consequences are palatable to the person,
as he has come to call it more recently. And what I find fascinating about this paragraph is that you can basically run the objection the other way as well. Imagine that Anti-Benatar from Opposite World is writing a book called Great to Have Been, Why You Should Be At It Like Rabbits. We might imagine him criticizing the asymmetry principle a bit like this. How reliable can an intuition be if it allows the extinction of the human race and could justify governments forcibly sterilizing their populace? Such an intuition would not be worthy of respect in any other context.
This is what I mean by yeah, exactly. So he's about to talk about reductio ad absurdums, and it's like, that's what I was saying before. Like, one man's reductio ad absurdum is another man's, well, that's a reasonable point of view.
Are both attempts,
like, for example, there will be many people who just simply the conclusion, and I think this guy has hinted at this, simply the conclusion that it's immoral to procreate would be considered by many people as a reductio ad absurdum. Whereas obviously antinatalists are like, well, no, that's the whole point. That's that we see that as a reasonable conclusion to come to. So yeah, it gets very tricky.
At a reductio ad absurdum argument, they aim to show the absurdity of a set of premises by pointing to a conclusion that is obviously false. But it's not clear to me that the second paragraph is any less convincing than the first one. This seems to be a genuine clash of intuitions. So, which do we pick from? Well, Benatar is obviously aware of this problem, and in later years he has alluded that he thinks antinatalism is the wiser choice. By wisdom here, he seems to be referring to some process whereby we set competing ethical intuitions against one another and see which is better supported. But there is a real question about what better supported would mean in this context. Especially if you're not a straightforward moral realist, how do we judge which of the ethical intuitions is wiser than the other? And even if you are a die-hard moral realist, and you think there is a determinate right answer to every ethical question, there is still the epistemological issue of how to find it. This is not just a problem for the antinatalist, but the extent of the clash between the antinatalist and the pronatalist intuitions are unusually extreme. So it brings this meta-ethical problem out into the open in a rather nice way. Benatar also argues that we have excellent reason for thinking that pronatal intuitions are the product of, at least non-rational, but possibly irrational, psychological forces. And I find this point interesting in a very similar way. It implies that there is a division between rational ethical intuitions and non-rational ones, i.e. that our ethical intuitions are subject to some higher force called rationality. But this division seems to require some pretty significant epistemological grounding. For instance, what makes my intuition that pain is bad rational? The trouble is, we normally call things irrational when there is some violation of the laws of logic in the reasoning applied, or if it flies in the face of some pre-established standard.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of agree with this guy, because it's like, unless you present a reductio ad absurdum and the person will accept it, I mean, even then, I don't know if that comes down to rationality, but I don't know. When it comes to intuitions, I don't know if you can really battle it out on, is one more rational than the other? Yeah, because it's like, then you've got to appeal to some external standard, and it's like, what standard do we have to be able to measure the rationality of intuitions? Intuitions don't seem like the sort of thing that you can measure. Yeah, it's very Yeah, it's a very difficult one.
Thus, it is irrational to affirm the consequent, and it is also irrational to sacrifice your queen for no gain during a chess game. But the intuition that having children is morally neutral or morally good does not contradict a law of logic. And because this debate strikes at the heart of what it means for an action to be ethical, it doesn't seem like there is a higher standard to appeal to. This is setting the standard. You can almost feel Benatar's frustration at not having a knockdown argument against the unintuitiveness objection, and I totally get where he's coming from.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I also get frustrated, but at the end of the day, it's like the universe doesn't exist to be to hold like neat ethical solutions to things. Like sometimes there will just be things that we can't make a knockdown argument against because it's just based on you have this fundamental intuition and this other person has this fundamental intuition, and there's no way to really say who is wrong and who is right, especially given, like, personally I don't think morality is objective. So like there's no law of morality written out there somewhere that we can appeal to, so that makes it even harder. And yeah, I mean, obviously I'm gonna say this, but like, especially given the world we live in, I think that pronatalism is much more sick and twisted than antinatalism is. I just see no issue at all concerning the person that you could create not to create them. There is simply no one who exists to be harmed by that. But if you create someone, sure, they can live a good life. It's a good life that they never existed to want in the first place. But they could also undergo so much harm, and many people do undergo a lot of harm. And yeah, a pronatalist can just say the same thing as me, but mirrored. And I don't know, like sometimes you can't reconcile the differences. Sometimes you'll be able to convince others, sometimes you won't. That's why, like, on this channel, I engage in debate and stuff with people, and to some extent try to convince people. But I actually think most of the good that antinatalists can do is not necessarily through convincing people, although that will play a part. It's in engaging in other acts that will make the world a better place that aren't necessarily based on convincing people to do X, Y, Z. For example, starting an organization or donating to an organization that does work that will, in an ethical way, reduce the birth rate. You know, for example, family empowerment media, or, you know, helping people out of poverty that generally reduce, or like female education, or just education in general, lowering infant mortality rates. These are things that generally bring the birth rate down. Obviously, you can make the world a better place in other ways that are like independent of antinatalism. But yeah, it's frustrating to try and convince people of your point of view, especially when it gets at something so fundamental and is fundamentally something that's probably based on intuition. But if that's really frustrating to you, then you can do, you know, good things that are, you know, good things other than that. So, yeah.
In effect, the trouble is that in ethics, our moral intuitions are both the very things we are putting to the test and the standard by which we're testing them. In Benatar's case, the intuition that having children is good or neutral is being put to the test against the intuitions behind the asymmetry principle. The pronatalist is instead putting the asymmetry principle to the test against the intuition that having children is morally neutral or good, or at the very least that coming into existence is not bad. Arguably, this is part of the inherent epistemic uncertainty that comes with edge cases in ethics. There's a pretty wide literature on this very problem in metaethics. I'm not suggesting that there are no solutions, but rather that antinatalism is a good example of where this becomes especially prominent. But this, in turn, leads to a pretty interesting potential objection to antinatalism. At one point in his book, Benatar says that one of the only responses to antinatalism he has much time for is an epistemic point about uncertainty. Here, someone would argue that the antinatalist may be wrong, and there is enough doubt in their conclusions that we should not make broad decisions like phasing out the human race on their basis. Benatar's response to this is totally understandable. He says that unless they can point to a specific thing wrong with the arguments put forward by the antinatalist, then they're sort of gesturing at a critique rather than making one. However, the epistemological challenges we just looked at reopen this position. Benatar's argument is no longer as clear or inferentially neat as it was before. Now he has the addition of this wisdom component, for instance. We also confront the clash between the two ethical intuitions, and the reason to suspect that one decisively winning out over the other may be very doubtful. Suddenly, the epistemic objection appears to have gained quite a lot of ground. If it is either genuinely indeterminate which one of these intuitions is more justified or rational than the other, or if there are significant difficulties in us finding out which one is the determinate victor, then there is room to argue that, considering the vast implications of antinatalism, we cannot be certain enough in its arguments to assent to it. At least, not yet. I'm not particularly married to this argument either way, but I do find it especially...
I'm just reading the text that he's put up. So to give just one response, you could argue that this argument too runs in reverse and that the pronatalist must also adopt a form of quietism about birth.
Really interesting, as it crosses over with ethics, epistemology, metaethics, and even decision theory, arguably. Of course, there are many objections raised to each point Benatar makes in this book. There's arguably not a single uncontroversial step in the whole thing, but I highly recommend that you read it for yourself. Whether you find the arguments convincing or not, it can provide a real insight into what ethical argumentation looks like when the stakes are high and the chips are down. It will challenge some of your deepest preconceived intuitions and force you to question how we know whether something is right or wrong. But if this video has whetted your appetite for tricky ethical dilemmas, then click here to watch my take.
So that was the video.
We bring children in this world and we raise them to
be warriors against evil. All right, we have a donation getting in there near the last minute. They've put their name on it, so I can say thank you so much, Bovine Blue Stocking. I actually can't remember what the I said your name wrong the first time you donated. And I can't remember how I said it. Yeah, but I got it like very wrong. But anyway, thank you so much for the support. And Bovine says, you're on fire today. No wonder there are fireworks going. Yeah, I don't understand. What were those fire? So I was sometimes, if I do the thumbs up, it happens like that. I can't remember why it does that. I think it's because I'm using an Apple device. But then I was doing something like that, and fireworks happened. I don't know. But anyway, keep up the good work. And then they say, I'm going to sneeze. Oh yeah, that was it. Bovine secretions. That's so funny. Okay, I'm not gonna sneeze. And then they say, are you still thinking of doing fundraiser live streams? Yes. So I'm still thinking of doing fundraiser live streams. I'm in the process of thinking about like what would be the most appropriate thing to be reacting to or to do on the live stream whilst fundraising. But I'm expecting like in the next month will be the first fundraiser live stream. And what I'll be doing is picking a charity to donate all the proceeds to. It will very likely, the first one will very likely be like family empowerment media or some charity like that. In the future, unless someone provides me a suggestion that I think is so good to stray from what I'd already had planned, I will do a different charity. But all the charities that will be fundraised for will probably be on the Antinatalist Advocacy website on the charities we recommend on there. So yes, I still plan to do them. It's very likely going to be family empowerment media. I've got a couple of things to work out. So one thing I want to work out is that there's such a thing as donation matching. So I plan to have the first stream with a goal of £100 raised over the stream, and what I'm thinking of doing is trying to find someone who will match the donations. So what that means is they commit to giving the same amount that I can fundraise on stream. So for example, if through the stream people donate £60, for example, this other person will match that and also donate £60 on top of it. So if we meet the £100 target, then actually £200 will get donated, £200 minus the fees of the donation platform. £200 will get donated to the charity because there will be a matcher, a private donor matcher. So if there's anyone watching who actually, I probably will have the target as £100. So if there's anyone watching who does want to be a private donor who has £100, who wants to be the person who matches, this will obviously double all of the donations, but it will also increase the likelihood that people will donate because the donations they make are essentially double what they're paying for, if you get what I mean. So basically, yes, I will be doing one soon. It will probably be Family Empowerment Media. The goal will be £100. I'm looking for a person who can hopefully double, who will match the donations up to £100. And I'm also thinking about what is the best thing to react to in that first stream. I might just do a normal live stream reacting to something, but it happens to be a fundraiser as well. But I want to do something a bit special. And I've actually just thought of something a bit special that I can do it for. So I won't say now because I don't want to reveal it, but I've actually had an idea, which I think is what I will do. So yes, I think I know what theme the first fundraiser will be. So good. Thank you for asking that question, Bovine, because that has actually just made me think about a few things and I've sort of worked some stuff out. So yes, the main thing to take from that is that there will be a fundraiser live stream soon. And also, if you have £100 on the hip and want to help encourage fundraising in the antinatalist community, please send me an email. I will put my email in the chat. Yeah, that's it. So I've put my email in the chat. Please send me an email if you would like to match the donations. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too ambitious, but even if 2 people come forward and say they want to match, then it would be tripled. So, if we get £90 donated and we just shy of the target, even with that £90, then an additional £180. So instead of it's £90, it's £270 would be donated to the charity. So anyway, I think you get the point. But thank you for the donation, Bovine. Thank you for the question. And yeah, if anyone is interested, please email me. But cool. Anyway, so about that video, I thought it was very good. I enjoyed it. I thought he was very fair. It came off a bit like he was kind of like he's somewhat sympathetic to what Benatar was saying. I don't know if he was like convinced and got to the point where he's an antinatalist, but it probably raised some points that he hadn't considered before, and he was kind of sympathetic to Benatar's arguments. Whether he was sympathetic to all of them, I don't know. I don't know the guy. I've never interacted with him. But there we go. Cool. I've not paid any attention to the chat today. Apologies for that. I hope the discussion was fruitful. I really have no idea what you guys have been talking about. But thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to everyone for engaging. Thank you, Bovine, for the donation. And I guess I will see everyone in the next one, actually, very quickly. So there will be a video coming out tomorrow. That will be another one on the topic of Jordan Peterson. He has done a boo-boo again. And then I have another one coming out probably next week. If anyone is a fan of poetry, the one next week will be on Philip Larkin, if you know who he is. So yeah, I think that's everything to say. So anyway, thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. And I will see everyone in the next one.